Well, good morning. I lied last week, said we did not have a Reader's Theater for today, but we do have a Reader's Theater today. This is called The Baker's Dozen. Original story by Aaron Shepard. I found it surfing the net one day a couple of years ago. Aaron Shepard is a prolific writer with some 60 children's books carrying his name. From what I've been able to find out, The Baker's Dozen was originally written for a class of fourth graders, or they used a class of fourth graders as a test audience at a parochial school in Bellingham, Washington. What fascinated me about the story was the portrayal of St. Nicholas. We are so accustomed to understanding St. Nick as a jolly, rotund character who lives at the North Pole and once a year delivers presents to all the children who do not cry or pout and who are good for goodness sake. However, Shepard borrowed from the Dutch tradition of St. Nicholas. You will remember from maybe your fourth grade history classes that the Dutch established their presence in the New World, what we now call North America, by occupying and then buying an island in the Hudson River, Manhattan Island. And they called it New Amsterdam. In time, like so many other early settlers, the Dutch began to spread outward from the island to what is now New York State. Our story takes place in Albany, New York, sometime in the 17th or early 18th century. You will notice that Shepard sees the character of St. Nicholas in several ways that are different from our traditional images of St. Nick. In the Dutch tradition, St. Nicholas is a tall, lean person who looks taller than he really is because he always wears a mitre, a bishop's hat. Also in the Dutch tradition, St. Nicholas can assume disguises. He can be a young person, a middle-aged person, an old person. He can be either male or female. The Dutch St. Nick does not live at the North Pole. St. Nick in the Dutch tradition is always available in all places at all times. Lastly, St. Nicholas is not carted around in a sled pulled by reindeer. In the Dutch tradition, he has a great white horse. In Aaron Shepard's original story, there were 15 voices involved in the reading. 13 of them were narrators. Shepard wanted everyone in the fifth grade class to have a role. I have taken some license in boiling the narrator's part down to just one voice. Today, Doug Cummins will be the voice of the narrator. Kathy Trotter will be the voice of an old woman. And I will be the voice of the baker, Van Amsterdam. The Baker's Dozen, an original Reader's Theater written by Aaron Shepard, adapted, staged, directed, and produced by yours truly.
In the Dutch colonial town later known as Albany, New York, there lived a baker, Van Amsterdam, who was as honest as he could be. Each morning he checked and balanced his scales, and he took great care to give his customers exactly what they paid for. Excuse me a moment. And not less. Van Amsterdam's shop was always busy because people trusted him, and because he was a good baker as well. And never was the shop busier than in the days before December 6th, when the Dutch celebrate St. Nicholas Day. At that time of year, people flock to the baker's shop to buy his fine St. Nicholas cookies. Made of gingerbread, iced in red and white, they look just like St. Nicholas as the Dutch know him, tall and thin, with a high red bishop's cap and a long red bishop's cloak. One St. Nicholas Day morning, the baker was just ready for business when the door of his shop flew open. In walked an old woman wrapped in a long black shawl.
I've come for a dozen of your St. Nicholas cookies.
Taking a tray, Van Amsterdam counted out 12 cookies. He started to wrap them, but the woman reached out and stopped him.
I asked for a dozen. You've only given me 12.
Madam, everyone knows that a dozen is 12.
But I say a dozen is 13. Give me one more.
Madam, my customers get exactly what they pay for. Not more, not less.
Then you may keep your cookies. Van Amsterdam, however honest you may be, your heart is small and your fist is tight. Fall again, mount again, learn how to count again.
Then she was gone. From that day, everything went wrong in Van Amsterdam's bakery. His bread rose too high or not at all. His pies were sour or too sweet. His cakes crumbled or were cheery. His cookies were burnt or doughy. His customers soon noticed the difference. Before long, most of them were going to other bakers.
That old woman has bewitched me. Is this how my honesty is rewarded?
A year passed. The baker grew poorer and poorer. Since he sold little, he baked little, and his shelves were nearly bare. His last few customers slipped away. Finally, on the day before St. Nicholas Day, not one customer came to Van Amsterdam's shop. At day's end, the baker sat alone, staring at his unsold St. Nicholas cookies.
I wish St. Nicholas could help me now.
Then he closed his shop and went sadly to bed. That night, the baker had a dream. He was a boy again, one in a crowd of happy children, and there in the midst of them was St. Nicholas himself. The bishop's white horse stood beside him, its baskets filled with gifts. Nicholas pulled out one gift after another and handed them to the children. But Van Amsterdam noticed something strange. No matter how many presents Nicholas passed out, there were always more to give. In fact, the more he took from the baskets, the more they seemed to hold. Then Nicholas handed a gift to Van Amsterdam. It was one of the baker's own St. Nicholas cookies. Van Amsterdam looked up to thank him, but it was no longer St. Nicholas standing there. Smiling down at him was the old woman with the long black shawl. Van Amsterdam woke with a start. Moonlight shone through the half-closed shutters as he lay there, thinking.
I always give my customers exactly what they pay for. Not more, not less. But why not give more?
The next morning, St. Nicholas Day, the baker rose early. He mixed his gingerbread dough and rolled it out. He molded the shapes and baked them. He iced them in red and white to look just like St. Nicholas. And the cookies were as fine as any he had made. Van Amsterdam had just finished when the door flew open. In walked the old woman with the long black shawl.
I've come for a dozen of your St. Nicholas cookies.
In great excitement, Van Amsterdam counted out 12 cookies and one more.
In this shop, from now on, a dozen is 13.
You have learned to count well. You surely will be rewarded.
She paid for the cookies and started out. But as the door swung shut, the baker's eyes seemed to play a trick on him. He thought he glimpsed the tail end of a long red cloak. As the old woman foretold, Van Amsterdam was rewarded. When people heard he counted 13 as a dozen, he had more customers than ever. In fact, Van Amsterdam grew so wealthy that the other bakers in town for over a century, and alive in some places to this day, began doing the same. From there, the practice spread to other towns, and at least through all the American colonies. And this, they say, is how 13 became the baker's dozen, a custom common throughout the land.
Thank you. My thanks to Doug and to Kathy. Any comments? No. Don't be shy. All right. Hold on.
I just wanted to say thank you for telling us this story. Now, when I get 13, I will know why.
Okay.
I think it's a good reminder to always give more, and when you give more, you find out that it really doesn't hurt.
What about seeing St. Nicholas in a different light? How did that impress you, or did it impress you? Do you think it's a good thing to see St. Nicholas in a different light? Why?
Well, it's not just giving, but teaching. And I think probably as parents we should be mindful of that. That Christmas isn't only about giving, it's about hopefully learning.
Yes, he's not just for children. Also, the ability to change shape and be somebody else to anybody it's like an old story when somebody, when an ugly old witch makes somebody have pity on her and turns into a beautiful princess. That's kind of an age-old thing. But the universality of him being able to give something directly to somebody because of the way they acted towards him is a lot different than Santa Claus just giving toys to children.
I have one. My father, Jim Cummins, was a designer and manufacturer of custom-built store fixtures. And he did store fixtures for classy department stores, and all in Texas, and women's stores. But he never really measured exactly the wood that he put in the designs. If it went over an inch or two, it was just part of it. He would cut it back to the last foot. And one time I said, "Dad, what are you doing here?" He said, "I'm giving the baker's dozen." I just thought of that today. And I always honored and respected my father, but he just went up another notch this morning.
Well,
sometimes in classes like EFM or in seminary, we use the word myth to describe a story that might be literally historically true, but is also true in a bigger sense, a story that explains something just true about life. And although I missed most of the performance, most of the reading, part of the Santa Claus myth, as we allow it to be reinterpreted, helps me remember to have an attitude of abundance, that magic of where did this come from under the tree? Whether it's a kid on Christmas morning or a family or a surprise like this, just the magic of seeing that there's a surprise, there's more, helps me remember the truth that St. Nicholas sort of reminds us, that there's always enough if we look for it.
The church where I attended in Shreveport had this club for handicapped individuals. And every Christmas the church would adopt a family and give the kids Christmas. And so they adopted a family that was kind of related to this group. And they weren't going to have much of a Christmas without this. And I remember as one of the little boys was opening presents, every time he would open one, another one would come. And he would say, "More?" And it was just like it blew his mind. And he kept, every time another present would come, that was his refrain. And so that's what that reminded me of, this story.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. And I promise there will not be a Reader's Theater next Sunday.